This week, we have the good fortune of sharing a very open and candid conversation with Nurul Muktadir Bappy. Bappy is from Bangladesh and has been working in the garment industry there since 2011. Though he is now head of operations for a sourcing office, he spent much of his career to date working for a manufacturer.
We talked to Bappy about why he decided to enter the fashion industry and how the industry is perceived within Bangladesh. This brings us into much more conceptual territory about how, as a society and as an industry, we assign value to different types of work.
We get into the disconnect between the glamorous world of fashion design and the blue-collar world of production, and how, as sustainability advocates, part of our task is to reimagine how value is distributed and to elevate the makers of fashion.
We then get into Bappy's time working with a manufacturer, and a feeling he describes as saying that he was on board a sinking ship, but not knowing how to stop it.
Though we have often looked at how an unequal distribution of risk and reward affects relationships between supply chain actors, in this episode we take a slightly different angle. How does the broader context within which a factory operates impact the relationships and the dynamics within the factory itself?
Next week, we will share part 2 of this conversation, where we get into why, if life as a garment supplier is so difficult, do suppliers continue to do it? So be sure to come back and listen again next Tuesday. If you are on Instagram, please follow us to help us grow the conversation at manufactured_podcast.
Not much of an Instagram person? We feel you. We have a love-hate relationship with social media too. Sign up to our weekly newsletter instead on our website, www.manufacturedpodcast.com, to find out what we're reading, what we're thinking, and what we're wishing.
If you'd like to support us financially, you can make a Patreon donation via our homepage. And finally, don't forget to leave us a rating on iTunes and hit subscribe.
Bappy, thank you for joining us today. Let's start with the beginning, or at least your beginning. Your family has a history of being involved in the garment industry. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my father, he worked in the garments in the 80s. In the middle of 80s, he joined garments. And he was actually a scholar person. He did his graduation and post-graduation in English literature. And from Dhaka University, which was then the supreme academic institute in the country. So back then in the 80s, garments was so new in Bangladesh that when he planned to join garments, everyone was like, okay, you have gone crazy because now you will be a tailor with a university degree. So that's how people discouraged. That's how people discouraged my father. But he somehow saw the potential. My father worked for one of the pioneer groups in the country, and he actually started as the communicator with the customer. But also at the same time, he was one of the very few people, like very handful of people who had an education degree to enter the garments business. Garments was back then very much, how do I put it? It was a lowly business, to be honest. Like people didn't need an education degree to get into garments. So he started it. And then in the beginning of 90s, he worked for Ononto Apparel. Ononto is right now one of the biggest giants in garments in Bangladesh. Its MD is one of the directors of BGMEA. So Ononto is still there. So he started with most basic of the basic items because the training period was going on to teach the workers how to sew and everything. So even if it was we remember that even if it was a very basic jacket without the collar, it would be a very fancy item back then.
So you kind of grew up around the textile industry in Bangladesh, but joined it, of course, much later. Can you tell us about why you decided to enter the textile industry?
As you said, that I grew up in a textile environment because my father started garments, working in the garments before I was born. So we grew up hearing the garments lingo, like we mixed with people who were in this trade. And garments was a different trade back then. There was immense potential, and I saw my father, he was very passionate about it. And it wasn't just about earning money, it was about making a change. We heard him talking about customers and talking about developing new products. And back then, there weren't too many washing factories, too many accessories factories. So they had to source it, and sometimes from outside, and they had to develop say a Chinese button locally. So that involved a sort of creativity, innovation, and then setting up a factory meant hiring workers from very, very far away because there was no cluster. So the vision that they worked with, that okay, let's start with basics, then we slowly gradually move on to better customers, bigger volumes, that actually inspired us a lot. And as a whole, the company, the environment was very homely. Like we remember that my father was going to workers weddings to very remote village, because they invited their superiors back then, that okay, please come to our weddings, because it was like a family. There were too many picnics, too many annual days and holidays. So it was very enchanting for us that okay, these are the people we are working with, and these are the same people we are hanging out with on holidays. And my father died when I was still in school, so there was a gap. And then I studied, and I actually went to I did well in my studies, to be very honest. And I went to the topmost private business school in the country, which is also the most expensive one. But because I could manage 100% scholarship, I could actually afford it. I saw that there were students, my fellow students, who came from the industrialist families, politician families, very educated families, and they had a very a very negative attitude toward garments. I remember one day having a conversation sitting in the cafeteria, and I was very passionately discussing about garments to one of my classmates. And in the middle, he cut me off and he said that, Bappy, please stop. I won't spend the rest of my life sewing underwears for Europeans. So let's switch to another job. So that was the general concept, that if you are entering garments, you have to be a tailor and you have to deal with workers. So that concept hasn't changed. So when I was still in my business school and I was still having my graduation, I felt that this narrative had to change. And seeing from the outside, I had the picture from my father's experience, and I felt that somehow it is there. So when I joined garments, I actually felt that no, a lot has changed in those 15 years since my father has died.
What year was that you were joining the industry?
2011, ending of 2011.
2011.
Yeah, I graduated in 2012. So the last 1 year I actually did both.
Can you elaborate what you mean, like about changing the narrative? What exactly do you mean by that?
Okay, so basically, there are different career options. Like, say, a school of business graduate would never think of getting into garments. An engineer would never think of getting into garments, even though some of the mechanical engineers in garments are getting very highly paid in Bangladesh. So despite that, we will rarely see a graduate, an engineer with a good degree getting into garments. Then if you talk about the general managers or the DGMs or the AGMs who worked 10 years ago, they won't bring their second generation to garments. So because garments has this negative uh, sort of atmosphere around it, that you have to deal with workers, you have to shout at them, and there are unrest and this and that, and this is not a very sophisticated job per se. So I felt that since I knew garments from the inside, I felt that no, garments has potential, and they know it from the outside, which is not true. So it's a bad advertisement, bad publicity. I have to change that. That's what I meant.
It's interesting because I had never quite articulated it in the way that you just articulated it, but I had sort of a similar experience in some ways when I was in Cambodia, because I really wanted to hire a Cambodian technical designer, because the technical designer is really the link with production. And of course, production is all Cambodian staff. Right. And in the end, I had to hire at different stages while I was there, people from different countries, from the Philippines, from Sri Lanka, at one point even an American, and I couldn't get Cambodians to fill that position. And part of it was about skills, that there wasn't really a strong technical design program in Phnom Penh that was, that could have people coming out of the program ready to do the job. But there were some. But those that did have the skill were people who had like kind of more of a design background, who were from maybe a wealthier background, and they were interested in fashion, but they were not interested in going to work in a garment factory because it was like seen as too blue collar. And it was like, no, I'm a designer, I'm in the world of, and that there was sort of like a mental distinction somehow between like the glamorous world of fashion and design and the world of production.
Very true, very true. Somehow here in Bangladesh as well, the people who are having a fashion designing degree, they think that fashion is only about runway shows and catwalks and glamour. They don't want to get their hands dirty. They don't want to know why sewing something is so difficult.
And I think we heard the similar thing from other people, that this is about how to distribute the value. This is about how we see value, right? Because when we talk about fashion, actually fashion and fashion business or garment business is the same thing. It's in the same word. But when we say fashion business, we have different feelings. And when we say garment business, we have another sort of feeling. I found it's lots of similarity in Bangladesh and in China. It's the same that when people talk about garment factories or talking about factories, they don't give value to it. They say it something like lower than other jobs or socially like lower.
It is.
Yeah, it's about how we see value. Actually, factories are the places of creating values and making values. Yet seems people don't say it that way.
True, and there are some like very peculiar understanding among people. Like when I call someone a machine operator, it's very lowly, but when I call the same person seamstress, it's somehow sophisticated. I don't know why, but general people think that these two are very different people, which in reality are the same. It's just the way we portray it. Yeah.
It reminds me too of some of the conversations like happening around me now. I'm in Europe now, of course, and the conversations we're having in terms of COVID and essential workers. And suddenly people are like, oh, the postal service, the delivery people, like the grocery, the super people who work in the supermarkets, these are our essential workers. They're the heroes of COVID. And yet the same story applies to people making our clothes. It's the kind of labor, I think, that often gets taken for granted.
Yeah,
they are taken for granted. To be very honest, they are.
So you decided you're just out of university. You decided, okay, you want to enter the textile industry in Bangladesh, and you ended up joining a manufacturer called EPCOT Apparel. Yeah. Can you give us some context for what EPCOT Apparel was at that time, the types of products you were making, and what kind of a production facility it was, and also what your role was within that?
Yeah, sure. So EPCOT there were three companies, EPCOT Apparel, EPCOT Jeans, EPCOT International. Two of them were in same compound in Gazipur, and another one in a different zone. So there were around 1,200 workers and 800 machines. We only did oven items and heavier oven items. We work with denim, twills, and heavier ovens. Not too many shirts, only occasionally. And we had some very reputed customers back then. We worked for Kiabi, we worked for C&A, Carrefour, Charles Vogler, Ocean, Laredud, Varbadut, and Lian Fung. And then we later on started working with LC Waikiki, like 3 years down the line after I joined.
It's funny because you say those are some very big customers, and yet I think to most consumers, maybe they would only recognize a couple of those names that you just listed, right?
Yes. True.
there are all these like intermediaries between supplier and brand that I think consumers don't know about.
Yes, for instance, Lian Fung is huge. However,
Yeah.
I don't
They are
think many
huge.
end consumers know what it is, but it's a huge business. Yeah.
And Lian Fung's parents own HSBC, right? So of course they are huge. Lian Fung is like the soul shark in Bangladesh.
What do you mean by that, the soul shark?
The soul shark means they have some unique capacities. Financially, their supply chain is very strong. They have their own logistics, they have their own development and everything. So Lian Fung is so huge that there is no second one. The ones in volume, in supply chain, they're far, far away. There are some names like Textile, which is a Singaporean company. Textile is also very huge. Then there is PDS Multinational, which is a Hong Kong-based company. They are big, but not as big as Lian Fung. So Lian Fung is like the super giant there.
For somebody who hasn't heard of these companies, how would you explain in a simple way their role?
Okay, so Lian Fung is an intermediary who takes the orders from customers, and by customers I mean by that I got to know when we were working with Lian Fung had a portfolio of 700 listed customers all around the globe, which is astoundingly huge. And those 700 customers would not necessarily have their own supply chain, their own development team, their own logistical supports. Sometimes their quantities would be smaller. Sometimes they would take only a few products, only few months of the season. So it's not a year-long product. So for that particular customer to go directly to a factory would not be that easy because factories look for consistent customers. Lian Fung as a whole works as an intermediary who combines those customers and then helps them with the developments, with the production, follows up everything. And Lian Fung for the customers is the supplier. Lian Fung outsources the productions in different factories, to different factories in Bangladesh. But for the end customer, Lian Fung is the supplier. So the customer opens the LC or sales contract to Lian Fung. Lian Fung then transfers it to as many factories as they want, and then they accumulate the goods and then they ship it to the customer.
They are taking orders and placing orders, and they have their own logistic. So it's that also make it become a huge player. And it just crossed my mind. But what you mentioned, all these big players, seems they are all foreign capital companies in Bangladesh, right?
Yeah, but also at the same time, you see, Lian Fung does not pay a single cent to the factories. What Lian Fung does is Lian Fung only changes the mechanism. Like if a customer is opening a sales contract, that I cannot open an LC. So Lian Fung opens the LC on his behalf, but there is no risk involved. Even if of course, there are some overhead expenses like maintaining an office and on the customers, but on the production supply chain, Lian Fung does not invest a penny. So the risk is pushed down the line.
Right, which is something that I think we see regularly.
Yeah.
I mean, when in season 1, we had a conversation with Pete, who owns Pactix, where Jesse and I used to work, and he describes himself as a bank because he's financing the cost of production 6 to 9 months before he sees any payment. So that's another way of saying that he's assuming all the risk. So let's go back to EPCOT. So you're working for EPCOT. It has 3 different entities and I guess 3 different production facilities, or maybe
Yes.
more than that.
3 different.
3 production facilities. And what exactly were you doing for EPCOT?
As I was a fresh graduate, or I was still in my studies, I did not have anything particular to do. What I was given the chance was I could sit with different departments to actually have an idea, because I was still in my final year of my graduation. So I actually could sit with different departments, and I was supposed to tell that, okay, which department I want to work with after 1 year. But when I started sitting with different departments, I sat with the factory manager and production manager, then the merchandising team, then the admin department, then the store, then accounts, then commercial. And then later on, as I sat with all of them, I started attending meetings together with them. So if a merchandising team was having a meeting with factory manager, rather than calling all the store people, they would call me because I knew what's happening in store. So that's how I became kind of a coordinator to be the, like the middleman among all departments. And then I had to report to my managing director that this were happening. And also between the managing director and the factory management and other management, there were this GM, the general manager, and the DGM, deputy general managers for different divisions. So they were also the ones who would take decisions. So I attended meetings with them. And actually, I was fortunate enough to get this chance, because normally this is not a very available chance for everyone to get to work with different people and know the full
Yeah.
story. And later on, I started attending meetings with banks, because commercial people would take me because I know the factory side of the story. And then I started attending meetings with customers, that, okay, these are the issues that's happening, and even some price negotiation. And then down the line, after 2-3 years, when I was directly taking decisions on some cases, in some cases, I attended some costing meetings. So yeah, you could say I became like a jack of all trades.
You've described your time with EPCOT, because you stayed there a long time, right? I think you stayed
Yes.
there 7 years in the end,
8
or more
years.
than
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. 7
8
years.
years,
Yeah.
8 years.
8 years. Yeah.
And you've described to me in the past your time there as feeling like you were part of a sinking ship and not knowing how to stop it. I'd love it if you shared a little bit in more detail what you meant by this.
Yeah, sure. Basically, what happened was, as I started sitting with people, I did not have any preconceived notion about the operation. All I knew about garments was from outside. That, okay, these happen. It was all the glorious picture, from the happiness, from the shipments and everything. I didn't know what the blood and sweat that went into it. As long as I entered the chain, I sat with merchants, I sat with store, I sat with admin. There was this feeling of complete helplessness that a factory as a whole I was feeling. Because I was very passionate, I was very young, and I was very immature. I took it personally, and I had this sense of belonging, that this is my factory and I have to make a change. But I saw that every department is completely ignorant and oblivious about others. Say, for example, if the suppliers, there are so many variables. Like for a supplier who is only supplying the size level, for his delay, the entire production line is sitting idle. Now, that supplier cannot be held accountable because he committed to deliver the labels in the morning, but he couldn't. He is sending it in the afternoon. Now, I cannot charge my production line cost from him because that is 10 times or 20 times the value of his labels, his entire commodity. But due to his problem, the entire line was suffering. Then, say, if there's shipment dates were colliding in the factory, what happened was the merchandisers were actually sitting, because the merchandisers shared a room. They were having discussions among themselves, and they managed extension, say, for customer C. And the other two customers, merchandisers A and B, they are saying that, okay, we'll manage 5 days extension. Now, when they pass on the message to the factory manager is saying that, no, I can make A in due time, but for C, I need more time because C is a fancier item. So when I was sitting between them, I was like, okay, why can't merchandisers know this? Why can't they have this easy communication that my support is to my stand is with the factory and I have to support the factory and I have to manage my customer accordingly. It's not the other way around. But as I got involved, I saw that no, in none of the case, factory side is hard. It's always the customer whose conditions are being applied. It's always the customer or their liaison offices who we had to abide by.
I just want to elaborate a little bit on this term merchandiser because I think it can be quite confusing. Bappy, in this case, you're talking about merchandisers employed by the factory, so who are effectively the liaison or the bridge with the brand, with the customer or the intermediary, whomever the customer for the factory might be. In this show, we've also talked about merchandisers as people who are employed by the brand. For example, in episode 2, Jessie shares quite a bit about her time working as a merchandiser employed directly by a brand. So I think maybe a useful way to think about it is, you have these merchandisers who are effectively these liaison points that are sometimes employed by the factory, sometimes employed by the brand, and sometimes employed by both sides as a counterpart for one another.
Then even in the customer's office, there were series of layers. Say the customer likes me, but his merchandiser is in favor of another factory. So despite the merchandiser's objection, if I get the order, the merchandiser would not give me approvals, none of the approvals in due time. So my shades aren't approved, my zippers aren't approved, nothing is approved because he is angry with me why I took the order. Or if it's the quality team, say the quality person who came to visit the factory from the liaison office, I don't know, maybe he wanted Coke, but we treated him with Sprite. So he took it personally and then he expressed it along the way that, okay, I will not come for PP meeting, I will not do the inline in time, and there are so many problems. So, like making issues, these sound small, but when you picture the whole facility, there were 7 different customers going on. And when we as a factory, we tried to keep all of them in line with countless variables, we found that at the end of the day, we being the factory were the losers, financially losers. So we always had to make a compromise at a cost. Okay, if a customer is forcing me to ship goods, say, without extension, I had to do overtime. Doesn't matter how many times I request that it was the unavoidable circumstances that is causing me the delay, I wasn't granted an extension. Or if it's a quality team's requirement, or if it's a merchandiser's requirement, sometimes liaison officers make mistakes. What they did was, if it's their mistake, they would tell us that, okay, please assume the cost and we'll adjust it later. That later never comes. But I, being the factory, I could not hold the liaison office merchandiser responsible, because if I do that, I will be colored and I'll be, in strong opposition of the whole liaison office. That would harm my business in most of the ways. So that made me feel very helpless that every day I saw the liability was increasing. And when I say liability, it's not only in terms of finance, it's also in terms of my relation with my colleagues, my co-workers, my workers, my other suppliers who are outside the factory but involved in the supply chain. Say, how do I put it? Like, I'm having a discount from a customer.
And it's important to note here the meaning of the term discount. We're talking about brands or whoever the factory's direct customer is requesting a discount from the factory, not the other way around, meaning the factory is the one who has to lower its price.
So if I am asking credit for my suppliers, they're not happy. Okay, so I am paying the customer discount from my pocket, but the customer is also unhappy, the factory people are not getting paid in time, and the suppliers are not happy as well. So yeah, it was a mess.
I can relate to this feeling of like having a lot of things outside of your control, which then have very adverse and negative consequences on your relationships within the 4 walls of your particular production facility.
Right.
How, as a manager, I often felt that I was just like we were being pulled in all these different directions. And I was just like, took all of my energy to just mediate the relationships between these departments and the teams that I was responsible for managing, because then they would get angry with each other when actually like part of the problem was sort of external to us.
Yeah, by the end of the day, you feel like you are extended towards all the directions. Like everywhere is pulling you.
And it was really difficult to keep us functioning as a team.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And you know what I was just thinking when I was hearing Bappy's story, I'm thinking part of the conflicts actually were decided by the nature of garment business. Garment is still labor driven and it's very subjective. The colors, the approval, the zippers, the workmanship. Somehow it's very subjective.
Yeah,
it relies
not
on
a science.
Subjective,
Yes, it totally relies on the other one on the other side of the screen or on the other side of the earth.
Judgment.
Just depends on that. So part of those conflicts actually decided by the nature of the business. However, there are some conflicts are just systematic, like for instance, the financial risks. It's true, all the financial risks are pushed down to the factory. As you said, Kim, that in the end, there are lots of things out of your hands, out of your control, yet the consequences, especially the negative consequences, were eventually carried by the factories.
Or with you. You know, I thought a lot prior to this conversation about how an unequal distribution of risk and reward affected relationships, sort of inter-supply chain relationships. So me as a supplier, my relationship with my customer, with a brand, and then also, of course, with my vendors further down, the people from whom I bought my raw materials. But it hadn't really occurred to me to think about it in terms of how this unequal distribution of risk and reward across this supply network also affected my relationships with my staff and my sort of internal team dynamic. And I always sort of, I don't know, I kind of thought about it or framed it in my mind, I guess, as my shortcoming as a manager, that I wasn't able to get people moving in the same direction or pulling in the same direction, and that somehow it was indicative of my own personal failure. And probably to a certain extent that's true. I mean, that's part of it. Maybe there were things I could have and should have done differently. But now that you articulate it this way, Bappy, it's also just like so glaringly obvious. Of course, you know, the world around you, the world outside of you affects your relationships internally as well. And I think this whole idea of bearing all of the risk without really any of the control over the factors that affect that risk is bound to be a recipe for disaster, or bound to be a set of conditions that makes positive working relationships internally very, very challenging as well. And I don't say that to sort of let myself off the hook, but only to just, I don't know, maybe give myself some space to reimagine what kind of things were affecting that dynamic that I might not have considered before. So thank you. All right, I think that's the perfect place to leave off for this week. But come back next week when we talk to Bappy about a question that we've had floating around in our minds for a long time, which is, if life is so difficult as a supplier in the garment industry, why do people continue to do it?
Thank you for listening to Manufactured.
To learn more about our guests and the issues we've chatted about today, sign up for our weekly newsletter on our website, www.manufacturedpodcast.com, or find us on Instagram at manufactured_podcast.
We'd also love to hear your stories and what you think. Collecting with listeners is the most rewarding part of what we do, so please don't be shy.
To be the first to find out about new episodes, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd also love it if you left us a review. Leaving a review helps other people find our show. And finally, if you'd like to support us financially, you can make a Patreon donation via our website homepage.
Thanks for listening, and see you next week.